Good morning and welcome to AB Talks. Now, there can be few more vital industries to the UAE than education. Like many industries in the past 18 months, it's had to adapt and adapt again to coronavirus, especially to ensure the well-being of its pupils, staff, and the wider community of parents. So today, I'm delighted to be joined on AB Talks by Dino Varkey, the CEO of GEMS Education, to unpack where the industry's at and where it's going. Dino, welcome to AB Talks.
Pleasure, Scott. Thank you so much for talking to us.
So let's start with your overview, your helicopter year. Tell us, where do you think education is at, and talk to us about the challenges that you've faced over the last 12 months and the ones you particularly feel you've overcome.
So certainly the pandemic has been, as I've described it to a number of people, perhaps the most unnatural social and economic dislocation of our lifetimes. And that's certainly the way that I've described it. For schools, yes, there was a significant and rapid transition to a different mode of learning, but I always like to look at the silver lining. It's an inflection point that's caused the acceleration of technology adoption in education. Technology has always been a part of education, but you could argue that the education sector has been notoriously slow to adapt and change to the needs of our world, both today and in the future. So I certainly think that it's been an inflection point that's caused this acceleration of adoption. And that's something that, from a GEMS standpoint, we've always believed and we've invested heavily behind our technology infrastructure. But I think the interesting point, which is important for everyone to understand, it isn't just about technology, though. The ability for schools to be successful during this period is actually a function of not just the technology, but having a consistent set of expectations across your people, your pedagogy, and your process. So that's certainly what I think the state of education is as far as the impact of the pandemic. If I think about the challenges that we've had to overcome, teachers have had to innovate and be creative and do more than they ever thought was possible. Our students have had to adapt to a different mode of learning, sometimes disconnected from the most important things in their education process, which is their peer group. As school administrators and school leaders, we've had to ensure that above everything else, our schools and our student communities are safe. But these are all things that, certainly from a GEMS perspective, we believe that we've handled as well as could be expected. I'm incredibly proud of what our schools have achieved. When around the world, the general sentiment around education is one where people are talking of learning loss, how our students have been adversely impacted by the pandemic, we delivered our best ever academic results. And I think we'll do it again. So when I think about our relative performance, it's one where we've actually extended our position over our peers.
I was going to ask you the question, over these last 12 months, what's been the hardest lesson for you to learn, but also what's made you the most proud? And you just talked there a moment ago about some of the things that made you proud.
The thing I'm most proud about, as I said, right, I think it's the passion, the dedication, and the ingenuity of our teachers, and frankly, student successes have always made us proud, right? And our students are remarkable. They've gone on to achieve, not just academically, but across all fields of their activity. If you're talking about perhaps the hardest challenge, it is a different mode of learning, trying to ensure that we're able to deliver the same quality of education provision in different types of blended formats, ensuring that we're still able to give our families the assurance of quality that we would in a pre-pandemic scenario. But again, I like to think of us as an agile organization, as an agile group of people, and I think that we've been able to respond appropriately.
I've looked at industries, and education is the same. You look at hospitality, anyone within logistics over the past 12 months have faced an incredible logistical challenge. You've almost had to become like air traffic controllers, ensuring that your pupils, your passengers, don't bump into each other to ensure social distance. How has the team responded to that as a logistical challenge? Because you have academic challenges, but then you have that pure logistical challenge as well.
I think it's part of the benefit of running a network of schools is that there are benefits and economies of scale that we're able to put to work, as it were, that perhaps a single school can't. So when we think about upgrading our health and safety standards and protocols, ensuring that our contact tracing is as it needs to be, ensuring that we're able to provide our staff appropriate access to vaccinations, to ensure that our physical infrastructure has the thermal cameras and the way signage that allow us to ensure that large groups of people aren't able to gather and potentially, infect one another. I mean, these are all things that we've done centrally. We're able to ensure that we're able to leverage best practice and then cascade it to all of our schools. So the standard that we're able to hold ourselves to is much higher.
How have you actually captured that best practice? I mean, have you yet to create a dedicated team that looks at this? I mean, how are you bringing that information into the business on a daily basis? So,
we have a central health and safety team where we are perhaps the only K-12 education company that's ISO certified from memory.
Okay.
So in terms of our health and safety protocols, so that's something that we've always had within the organization. It's that team that we look to effectively spearhead the standards that we need to put to work. We also have a relatively unique perspective on global education because we do have schools in other parts of the world and operations in other parts of the world. So it allows us to tap into what is working and what perhaps isn't working in different markets. And interestingly, when we look to how the UAE has managed the pandemic, it's certainly exemplary from a global perspective. And I think we're all hopefully witnessing the benefits of that as we sit here today.
Let's touch on that now that you raised that. Because there's many people that look at the UAE's response right now, actually call it the textbook response. We look at the UK, where I'm from, and its education system is obviously, it's faced its challenge. And I think today they're talking about coming out of lockdowns and that sort of thing. So how important has that public and private sector partnership been for the restarting, and the continual learning of the pupils here?
Yeah, look, I think we take a lot for granted because effectively our schools have been operating and operational and delivering high quality provision for this entire academic year. We sometimes make the assumption that that's normal and natural and what's happening everywhere else. Yeah. Obviously, that isn't the case. And as I told you, the general sentiment around education isn't one around the world that's in a very good place. I do think that we've been able to balance keeping society and citizens safe with allowing the economy to still function, making sure there's still enough momentum and impetus and energy. And that balancing act has been hard. You've got examples of countries and markets around the world which have certainly been perhaps much more conservative in their approach. They've certainly kept their citizens safe, but that's come at the cost of the economy. You've had the other extreme where people have perhaps prioritized the economy over the safety of their citizens. So again, we're incredibly fortunate that the leaders of this country and this nation have done what they have. And I'm cautiously optimistic about the future.
If you look back on the last 12 months, what have you put in place that you think is here to stay? Is remote learning here to stay as an option? You talked about an accelerant and the acceleration of technology. What have you taken from the last 12 months that's actually improved the industry, improved schooling, improved education? Certainly, I think,
if I think about teachers as an example, before the start of the academic year, the idea that a teacher could effectively engage with students in their classroom, both in class and online simultaneously, is something that even if you spoke to me, I would have questioned the efficacy of it. And yet we've seen it day in, day out, our teachers' ability to be able to sort of evolve their practice. And that's certainly something that I think is here to stay. The idea that you can have students in perhaps different settings still able to collaborate effectively. That is something that's here to stay, that actually gives us the benefit, and this is an interesting idea that we've certainly talked to the regulators about. Dubai and the UAE has an exemplary education system. I don't think people realize just how high performing it is, especially when you look at the private sector. Well, when we think about the UAE as an exemplar for many things, it is an exemplar for education. So there is this really interesting opportunity to be able to extend access to our schools here in the country to families and students in other parts of the world that haven't had the same benefit. And for me, that's a really interesting attraction principle for Dubai and the UAE. And it's certainly something that I know that they're looking at.
You get to expand beyond your borders without actually having to physically expand within your borders.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a trend. That's certainly a trend that we are forecasting, because continuing to build new schools is incredibly capital intensive. This perhaps gives a different form and format that's perhaps a little bit more efficient, that allows you to extend access to your provision, and that's exciting.
How much have you fleshed that idea out yet? And we were talking about the fact that people will no longer have to attend physically, but they still extract the qualification from that.
To be honest, it's something that's already been in place over the course of the last 12 months. If you think about the reality of and the challenges around mobility, we've certainly had instances where we've had families and students that haven't been able to get back into the country
outside of
have been accessing their education for a month or two, perhaps longer. We've had teachers in certain instances that have been unable to get back into country that are still delivering great lessons. They just aren't in Dubai. Today, the issue is that's on an exceptional and sort of circumstantial basis. Can it be something that's more structured and systemic? I think that's probably the next step.
So I'm a father of a 5-year-old girl that's going to be going back to school for the first time this September.
Okay.
So as a parent and as a pupil entering education, how's the landscape changed? What from our customer-centric point of view?
Are your children going back in for the first time? Or have they been into...
She was in primary and then came out for the pandemic and now is going back for the first time.
So first and foremost, she's going to be incredibly excited.
She is. And so is her mother.
All right. She's going to be incredibly excited. I mean, look, my own children, my daughter's been in school every day, right, for the last year. My son goes to a different one of our schools. He goes in every other day. I think children are excited to get back to be with their friends. I'm simplifying it, but being back with their peer group in that community is something that they're incredibly enthused about. I certainly know that, moments when we told our son, remember January when there was, a general escalation in cases. We suggested to him that he'd do 2 weeks at home remote learning, and he was desperately unhappy with us, and especially his mom. Because again, just as effective, and I think we've all seen this from a working perspective, working online, studying online, it's effective. It's perhaps incredibly productive. But I don't think the human condition is quite ready for it yet.
I was going to ask, is that reflected amongst the teachers and the staff as well? To have that connection
I think so.
With the pupils, with the...
Absolutely, right? I think, and certainly generationally, I don't want to speak for future generations, but certainly generationally as we are today, the human condition and our humanity thrives on interaction, right? And real sort of engagement, which... for as efficient as online is, it's never quite going to replace that feeling, that sentiment that you get when you're back in school. And certainly when we surveyed our parents during the lockdown, and this is going back to last March and April, because we wanted to understand if there were changes in preferences. Well over 95, 96% would say that they want to be back in school. And certainly, the experience of home learning for some families, they were probably very, very keen to get their children back to school. There were sort of on the margins, families that would consider online, 7 to 9%. But again, it felt like it would be in certain extreme cases. Right. So I think the good news there is brick and mortar is here to stay. I mean, back to your question about, are things going to be different for children? I think they'll adapt very quickly to being back in school. I think there'll be an interesting dynamic for those students that perhaps started this last academic year online and are going back into school for the first time next year. They would have probably developed some interesting habits that will need to be sort of worked on by the school and by their teachers.
That's an interesting thing. It's almost a bit like the going back to the office, mental health argument that we have around mental health issue that we talk about in the world of work. But if we stay with that for a moment, because GEMS is a family business,
of course,
and I imagine that extends to the teachers, the staff,
of course.
So the wellness and the mental health of the family, particularly during this past 18 months. What have you done in that space, and how important is that as an evolving space? Because there's a growing conversation about mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. I think well-being, student well-being, well-being of families, well-being of teachers is something that I would like to think that, one of our core values is about caring. Yeah. And it's a really deep sort of embedded value for the organization and the family. But it's really been brought to the forefront during the pandemic. So for us, it's a range of initiatives and interventions that we have in place. For our staff, we have a Care to Share hotline, which is available to them at all points. It provides them access to specialists within the organizations that are able to support them through a particular issue that they may be dealing with in that moment. Based on the severity of the issue, we then have the ability to be able to bring on board leading specialists from agencies and firms outside that can provide that support. Within schools, there's been this range of interventions and initiatives, from well-being weeks to elements of well-being and well-being curricula that are being embedded into our schools. Because, again, for our students to be able to perform, they need to be happy. Yeah. They need to be settled. They need to have peace of mind. Even extending our Care to Share hotline for our students is something that's the next step for us.
Right.
And it's a range. In some cases, students want the anonymity of being able to speak to someone that they actually don't know. Yeah. To another extreme where we actually have students that have been trained to provide support to their peers. So you have everything from peer-to-peer support to specialist external support. And again, that's something that we're really proud of across our schools. I would argue, as I would, that it's market leading, but we're not done.
I mean, that fascinates me as well. Arabian Business, we do a lot about resilience and mental health.
Of course.
Do you think the education industry almost has a first mover advantage in this space, in the fact that you are a very empathetic industry to start with? You're talking about dealing with and shaping young minds, so you come at, and all your staff come at that individual human challenge. Whereas we've got other industries that are, more corporate in nature that really need to get on board that train. What can they learn from the education industry?
I personally haven't thought about it in that way, but it certainly makes sense. It's logical. At the end of the day, our organization, our business is first and foremost about people, whether it's our staff or our students or our families. I don't think we have the option to do anything other than focus on the well-being of our community. Yeah. Other sectors perhaps think it's optional or there's optionality in it. Yeah. But,
in reality,
you can look at any business or any sector that's really successful, independent of what they do. Their success lies in their people.
Yeah. I mean, fundamentally, you are a knowledge-based economy, so therefore you have to look after people.
So it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that sometimes we take for granted the space we're in. And again, if we look at the UAE, I think we take education for granted. In fact, as parents, we've got so much choice. In fact, now in the market, there are in other parts of the world, particularly created by the pandemic, lots of places in the world where there isn't a choice, and in fact, where some young children don't have access to education, and in fact, may never return to the classroom. Yeah. Particularly girls in rather impoverished places of the world. I know with GEMS Education and the work of the Varkey Foundation, Correct. Talk to me a little about what you're trying to do in that space to make a difference outside of your GEMS students.
Sure. The purpose of the foundation is common to the purpose that drives GEMS Education. We're driven by ensuring that we can provide a quality education to every child, no matter where they are. But within a commercial model, there are limits to how far we can extend that purpose. The foundation's mandate was to provide quality education to children that really cannot access or afford education.
Yeah.
But there's lots of things you can focus on. We primarily focused on doing it by building teacher capacity. So our focus has always been around teacher training and education leadership initiatives. When we focused on girls and female empowerment, one of the programs that we just actually stopped delivering, which was a UK DFID funded program and a Dubai Cares funded program. Actually, we had the Minister of Education from Ghana here yesterday, was about making Ghanaian girls great. And it was essentially a model where we built 2 studios in Accra. We were able to onboard exceptional teachers, and every day across 10,000 girls in rural communities across Ghana, they would teach English, maths, and effectively sort of female empowerment role modeling lesson. And that was incredibly successful. And it's a model that certainly we've asked different development agencies and others to take on board, because we actually think it could be an incredible solution for those students that are displaced in conflict. So those children that are today in refugee camps, displaced as a result of war, this model is something that anybody can take. It's pretty simple, because again, you invest in a studio, you need great teachers, and that studio can be anywhere. It doesn't have to be in country. Yeah. And then in these rural communities, the internet access or the Wi-Fi access is actually delivered through what they call VSAT technology, so very small aperture terminal that provides internet access via satellite. And so that's all you need. So it's a really simple model. It works in these very extreme situations, but that's an example of something that we think we've delivered that's been incredibly successful, that others can take on board and hopefully apply to different settings.
Looking at that success and what that success translates to on a human level.
Sure.
When you look at the work of the Varkey Foundation, what does that mean to you personally, particularly as a father of children?
For me, the foundation was very consistent with the values of the family. And I think that's where the affinity for the work of the foundation lies. If you speak to my father, he will speak to the days when my grandfather was earning, and I need to get this right, 500 dirhams a month. When he was earning 500 dirhams a month, it was a family obligation to provide 50 dirhams a month to those in need. But, prior to the foundation, a lot of the family giving was like a lot of families that were early in their philanthropic maturity. It was pretty reactive. We would support those causes that were either very topical in that particular moment or reactive based on requests that we got. And certainly when the foundation was founded, we were just thinking very, very closely about ensuring that whatever we did in the philanthropic space, it was sustainable. So the same focus that a business has on sustaining itself and sustainability, frankly, it needs to be the same in any philanthropic mission. Whatever you do needs to be sustainable, because otherwise you're never really going to deliver impact.
What does your grandfather's story mean to you as a leader and a CEO of a company? Because I noticed you've got on your wall there, you've got the plaque, which is like lead, follow, or get out of the way.
Oh, that's an interesting one. So I don't know if that's an adage that he subscribed to, if I'm being totally honest. So the story of my grandfather, and certainly my grandmother as well, I think it's a story of, as we look at it, sacrifice, an incredible amount of courage. They left behind their family. So again, my aunt, my father, they were at boarding school at a very, very young age. I always tell people, a lot of people don't know the story, but my father probably saw his parents once between the ages of 3 and 12, which is hard, right? Because they were here trying to make a better life for themselves and their family. So that sacrifice, that courage.
Difficult on both sides as well.
Of course, right? So that sacrifice and that courage, and I certainly know the early years here for my grandparents weren't easy. Look, everything that we're able to do today, all of the impact that I believe we're able to deliver wouldn't be possible if they hadn't taken that first step.
Is that perhaps a more important grounding than a Harvard MBA or a McKinsey course, for example?
So without dismissing the value of a McKinsey or a Harvard, certainly as I'm 18 years into my professional career, and as I look to those moments that have mattered, those moments that have had the greatest influence on me from a leadership perspective, they've been by virtue of the people that I've met, the leaders that I've had the benefit and the opportunity to spend time with. That's perhaps been a greater influence on my leadership and certainly my approach to trying to make sure that we're going to be as successful as possible than any course that I've done, if I'm being honest.
You're in the business of teaching. Who's taught you the most, and what was the most important lesson they taught you?
Ooh, very difficult to identify a single person. I would hope that I've learned, and it was a default position that I forced myself to get into, because naturally when you join a family business, and especially a business where we've never run it as a family business, if that makes sense. I know it's slightly contradictory. You know, it's very much a family business in terms of the values and how we try to run it, but by the same token, we do run it as a very mature institution, a multinational, and with everything that comes with it. But across that spectrum, it was important for me to be very open to learning from my peers, my colleagues that I worked with, from my students. I mean, if I'm being totally honest, I've learned more from our students this past year than I have in a number of years. I mean, we have a student advisory council because the principle of student voice has been incredibly important. So around well-being, but actually student voice and our students' ability to be able to influence and drive their own learning. So I've probably learned more from our student advisory council than I have from any of my other sources, certainly in the last 15 months.
Have they taught you about the adoption of technology? I only know that because I've got a 20-year-old son who keeps
my son knows more about technology than I do. I would like to think that I'm well versed in the consumption of technology, but actually the real skill, and certainly a skill that I think is important for a lot of our students, is actually not consumption, but it's actually, can you produce? Can you create? Can you work with the language? So, whether it's Python or anything else, the fact that my 12-year-old knows how to code is amazing for us and mind-blowing. It's almost, if they're that way inclined, it's almost this natural default position again for them. It's like, well, of course I do.
And how exciting is that as a space for you? Because there's a lot in the investment space right now. If we're talking to VCs, there is a lot of focus on ed tech and where ed tech goes.
Sure.
How exciting is that for you at GEMS?
Very much. I think it's one of these interesting things where, in our history, as I said, we've always invested heavily in our own technology platform and our own technology infrastructure. We've invested in ideas and concepts and companies outside. We failed. We've been successful. We've been across the spectrum. I think where there's perhaps been the most interesting innovation, it's actually been our own intellectual property. So our technology infrastructure and platform is something that we're seeing a lot of demand for from different parts of the world. Because I suppose the way that I describe it is, we're not a technology company developing a solution for the education sector. We're an education company with 60 years of legacy behind us that's coming up with a technology solution.
What keeps you up at night as a leader?
Health and safety of our children. I think safeguarding and making sure our children are safe, whether they're at school or at home. That's perhaps the most important thing we're always focused on. It's unfortunate that not all students have the benefit of a safe and loving environment. You have instances where this is a reality, and a reality that we need to deal with and confront and make sure our children are safe. So if there's anything that keeps me up at night, it's usually something that's related to a safeguarding issue, related to health and safety of our students. Those are the things, because our size from a probability standpoint means that even with the best will in the world, the chances of something happening are always there.
Exponentially.
Right?
Yeah,
I'd like to think again that we've got the strongest mitigants possible. We've got good frameworks and structures and processes and escalation mechanisms. We have the right expertise, both internally and externally, to be able to deal with this. But it's still going to be something that, God forbid, that issue occurs. How do you deal with it, right? So if there's one thing that keeps you up at night, that's it.
What's the one thing that's exciting you the most right now?
A lot of things. Getting back to normal, right? Getting back to normal is exciting. As strange as that sounds. I think, the moves that we're making in technology, incredibly exciting, because I actually think that it gives us an opportunity to democratize access to quality education, or to provide more equitable access to education in different parts of the world or around the world at a pace that's faster than what we could have done if we were simply going out and building more schools in different parts of the world. And I think the trajectory and the possibility of what we can do in that space is probably the second thing that's exciting.
Now, my last question is the one where I get you to do my job for me.
Ooh, interesting.
What's the one question I haven't asked you that I should ask you?
Oh, God, you're going to stump me now. What is the one question that you haven't asked? You know what? What do I see for the future of education in the UAE? There could be one.
So what do you see for the future of education in the UAE?
What do I see for the future of education in the UAE? Certainly, and we've talked about this, how we've dealt with the pandemic has effectively meant that as an education system, and also, while I'm very proud of our results and our best ever academic results, if you actually look at the system as a whole, the results that our students have achieved across the system is frankly exemplary. And if we were to do a comparison across core markets around the world, it's amazing how much the UAE would have improved. I certainly think that that's going to be, as I said, an attraction principle. I do think it's going to be an attractor as families choose to relocate to Dubai or the UAE because of the quality of our infrastructure, both education, healthcare, and otherwise. So I think that's certainly one which would lead me to believe that, you could argue that while there's been a lot of growth in the provision of schools and new schools within the country, the growth of the general system has perhaps been slower. And certainly this last year, the system contracted a little bit, but has been slower over the last 4 years. I do see an acceleration of the growth curve over the next 5 to 10 years.
If we look at particularly Dubai and the UAE government, and education's got a vital place to play here, isn't it? Because obviously they've got this message to the world that Dubai is open, UAE is open.
Of course.
There's a massive talent attraction and retention policy.
Correct.
There's a massive attraction in terms of the remote working visas and trying to bring families to the UAE.
Correct.
Now that makes education plays a fundamental part of that package to drive the UAE forward.
Absolutely.
How exciting is it to see the messages coming out from the leadership about, we've got the 2040 plan and everything that's involved in that?
Look, there's very few places that we'd rather be, is my simple answer, right? If I think about the global context.
I think we can all relate to that.
I think so, right? Yeah. I think, and certainly, we all have friends and family in different parts of the world. We've all been impacted by the pandemic and perhaps have lost people that are close to us or that we know. It's harder everywhere else. And so, there's a great element of gratitude that I think that we all have for where we are. But it's exciting. I'm generally a little bit more pessimistic in my outlook, so I'm cautiously optimistic about the future.
Dino Varkey, genuine pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you for joining us on AB Talks.
Thank you very much, Scott. It's a pleasure.